Why would disciples of Jesus keep the seventh-day biblical Sabbath? The Sabbath is its own reward. The reward for keeping the Sabbath is that we get to keep the Sabbath. The biblical seventh-day Sabbath creates a weekly cycle of encounters with holiness. Once a week, God beckons us to enter into a sanctuary in time where our souls can find spiritual rest and nourishment in His presence. On the Sabbath, we can set aside the cares and concerns of daily life and focus on things of the kingdom of heaven. The Sabbath allows us to slow down enough to spend quality time in God's presence, learning the things of His Word and plugging into extended periods of prayer, study, and worship. On the Sabbath, we spend time with our families and reconnect with fellow believers, fellowshipping under a pervading sense of the holiness of the day. In this way, the Sabbath functions as a spiritual recharge from which we can draw new energy and fresh stamina. We can use that weekly infusion of spiritual refreshment to carry us through the coming week. We use the recharge of the seventh day to sustain us in the mundane world of the other 6 days of the week. The laws of the Sabbath force the Sabbath keeper to submit his will to God and to rest in His provision. Ceasing from our labors reminds us that God is our provider and our sustainer. He is the true creator. If we choose to ignore the Sabbath, we do not in any way diminish the holiness of that day. God Himself has declared the Sabbath holy and blessed. The Sabbath is still the Sabbath, whether we participate in it or not. By failing to keep the Sabbath, we only exclude ourselves from it. We forfeit the blessing and holiness that the Sabbath has to offer. Why keep the Sabbath? Why would New Testament believers keep the Old Testament Sabbath? One could simply argue that the Sabbath is a commandment in the Bible. In fact, it's one of the 10 commandments. It's also one of the Bible's most oft-repeated commandments. It's God's holy day. It seems natural that Bible-believing people will want to keep the Sabbath. This is a good reason, and it's all the reason many believers need. But there's an even greater significance to the Sabbath than just the keeping of a commandment. The significance is drawn from Jewish tradition, which gives us a prophetic reason for keeping the Sabbath. Jewish teaching says that the seventh-day Sabbath provides a glimpse of the future, a foretaste of the kingdom of heaven. It prefigures the Messianic era. Moses revealed that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh day He rested. Yet the early rabbis did not view the story of the 7 days of creation merely according to its literal reading. They viewed the story of the 7 days of creation as a blueprint for the future, a broad outline for human history, as the scripture says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night." Psalm 90, verse 4. The rabbis compared each of the 6 days of the creation week to a millennium of history. The seventh day, the day of the Sabbath, represents the 7th millennium, the Messianic era. In the poetic words of the rabbis, the Messianic era will be the day that is altogether Sabbath. The rabbis envisioned a 1,000-year era of Sabbath rest, so to speak. The New Testament refers to the 1,000 years of Sabbath rest as the era of the kingdom of heaven. In fact, the biblical idea that history works together toward a final culmination and era of redemption is based on the weekly cycle of 6 days followed by the Sabbath rest. One might even say that the whole concept of an end times redemption and kingdom era hangs upon the observance of the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is not just an Old Testament idea. The Sabbath is all about the future. It's all about the coming kingdom.